Imagine walking through London on an ordinary afternoon when you hear a deafening crack. The ground starts shaking. People begin screaming. You turn around and see something impossible. A giant wall of beer is racing towards you. Not a few barrels, not a pub cellar flooding. An actual wave of beer. And within minutes, people would be dead. As ridiculous as it sounds, this really happened. In 1814, one of the strangest disasters in British history struck the streets of London. And it all started with a single wooden barrel.
To understand how this happened, we need to travel back to London in the early 1800s. This was a city very different from the one we know today. The streets were crowded. The air was thick with smoke. Open drains carried waste through many parts of the city, and one drink dominated everyday life: beer. Beer wasn't simply enjoyed after work. For many Londoners, it was a daily necessity. Water quality was often poor, and beer was consumed by people from all levels of society. One of the largest breweries in London was the Meux and Company Brewery. Located near Tottenham Court Road, the brewery produced enormous quantities of porter. Porter was a dark beer that had become hugely popular across Britain. Demand was so high that breweries began thinking bigger and bigger, and by bigger they meant enormous. The brewery stored porter in giant wooden vats. These were among the largest containers anywhere in the city. Some stood several stories high. Each contained vast amounts of beer, thousands upon thousands of gallons. And on the 17th of October, 1814, one of those vats was about to fail. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, an employee named George Crick noticed something unusual. One of the giant metal hoops surrounding a fermentation vat had slipped. The hoop was important. It helped keep the enormous wooden structure together. But strangely, this wasn't considered an emergency. These hoops occasionally failed. The brewery had seen similar issues before. Crick reported the problem to his supervisor. The decision was made to deal with it later. After all, there seemed to be no immediate danger. At the time, nobody realized the vat was holding more than 100,000 gallons of beer. The pressure inside was immense. Hour after hour, day after day. The wooden walls were constantly being pushed outward, and now one of the key supports had failed. The clock continued ticking. Workers carried on with their jobs. Outside, London carried on as normal. Then disaster struck. Without warning, the giant vat exploded. The force was extraordinary. The pressure released in an instant. Wood shattered. Iron supports flew apart. Beer erupted across the brewery. But the destruction didn't stop there. When the first vat burst, it triggered a chain reaction. Nearby vats were damaged by the explosion. Several more ruptured. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter were unleashed. Witnesses described what happened next as a flood. A massive surge of beer burst through the brewery walls. Brickwork collapsed. The wave poured into the surrounding streets. Some reports estimated the wave reached around 15 feet high in places. Houses near the brewery were hit first. Walls gave way. Buildings were damaged. Furniture was swept aside. Families found themselves trapped. The neighbourhood surrounding the brewery was one of the poorer areas of London. Many homes were overcrowded. People had little warning. One moment life was normal. The next, a torrent of beer was crashing through their homes. It's almost impossible to imagine. Beer flooded basements. Beer filled rooms. Beer rushed through narrow streets. And despite how absurd it sounds today, the consequences were deadly.
8 people lost their lives in the disaster. Some were trapped beneath collapsing buildings. Others drowned or were fatally injured during the chaos. Among the victims were women and children. One of the most tragic stories involved a wake being held for a young child. Several mourners gathered in a basement room. When the flood struck, the room was overwhelmed. Multiple people inside were killed. News of the disaster spread quickly across London. Crowds gathered near the scene. People struggled to understand what had happened. Newspapers reported the bizarre event. Many readers could hardly believe it. A brewery explosion causing a deadly beer flood sounded more like a joke than a real tragedy. But for the families affected, there was nothing amusing about it. Lives had been destroyed, homes had been damaged, and a normal autumn afternoon had turned into a nightmare. In the aftermath, questions were asked. Who was responsible? Could the disaster have been prevented? An investigation was launched. Eventually, a coroner's jury reached a surprising conclusion. The deaths were ruled an accident, what we might now call an act of God. The brewery was not held criminally responsible. Incredibly, the company was also allowed financial relief on the beer that had been lost. Without that assistance, some historians believe the brewery may have faced severe financial difficulties. The city moved on. The damaged area was repaired. And over time, the story faded from public memory. Today, most people have never heard of the London beer flood. Yet, it remains one of the strangest disasters in British history. A chain of small decisions, a failed metal hoop, a giant wooden vat, and hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter, all combining to create a catastrophe that sounds completely unbelievable. But it happened. And for a few terrifying minutes in 1814, the streets of London were swept away by a deadly wave of beer.